The airport was busy that morning. Travelers moved quickly, dragging suitcases behind them, talking on phones, or trying to calm restless children. The air smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies, mixed with the quiet hum of the public announcement system calling out flight numbers and gate changes. Among the crowd, a tall man in a dark suit moved calmly through the lines, carrying only a small briefcase. He walked with a quiet confidence, his posture straight and his eyes scanning the area, taking in the faces and movements around him. This was no ordinary traveler. He was the director of the FBI, one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country, yet at that moment, he looked like just another passenger, blending into the crowd. As he approached the security checkpoint, he noticed the usual long lines of people waiting to remove their shoes, belts, and jackets. Travelers muttered under their breath about the slow pace and the intrusive rules, but he ignored the complaints. He had experienced worse situations and had learned the importance of patience, even in stressful conditions. With a calm, measured step, he moved toward the officer at the front, ready to present his identification and boarding pass. The officer, a man in his 40s with a stern expression, looked at the director's credentials briefly before frowning. "Step aside," he said abruptly, waving his hand. The director, slightly surprised but maintaining composure, followed the instruction. He knew that sometimes security protocols were stricter for certain individuals, even for someone of his rank. "What seems to be the problem?" the director asked politely, handing over his ID. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. The officer squinted at the ID, his expression hardening. "This ID is unusual. I need to verify it with my supervisor." His tone was sharp, almost accusatory. The director had just stepped onto the moving walkway toward his gate when he noticed something unusual. The two officers who had initially detained him were no longer keeping their distance. Rick and Grant, both looking pale and tense, hurried slightly to catch up, their eyes fixed on the floor, as if they were trying to disappear into the tiles. The director paused for a moment, observing them. He had anticipated a follow-up from airport management or law enforcement, but what he saw next surprised him. The moment the director stepped off the plane, the atmosphere at the airport seemed to shift. Passengers, crew members, and staff who had followed the unfolding events were still murmuring among themselves. Some whispered, some stared in awe, and a few discreetly recorded videos of the officers who had once acted with arrogance now standing awkwardly nearby. The airport, once filled with routine activity, now seemed charged with tension and anticipation. After the director boarded his flight, the airport slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Passengers resumed walking through the terminals, flight announcements continued over the speakers, and the luggage carts rolled along the polished floors. But for Rick, Grant, and Helen, the day had changed forever. The events that had unfolded were no longer just a public incident. They had become a lesson, a turning point, and a personal transformation all at once. Rick and Grant stood together near the gate, their hands folded, heads slightly bowed, reflecting on everything that had happened. "I never imagined that one day could teach me so much," Rick said quietly. His voice held a mix of humility and wonder. "I thought I was doing my job right, but today I learned that there is so much more to being an officer than following orders or showing authority." Grant nodded. "I know. I feel the same way. I can't stop thinking about what the director said, the part about actions being more important than words. It made me realize that respect and fairness are not just ideas, they are responsibilities we carry every day." Helen approached them with a calm smile. "You both did well today," she said. "Not just in apologizing, but in truly understanding why your actions were wrong. Many people would apologize just to get out of trouble, but you accepted responsibility and learned from it. That's rare, and it shows real growth." Rick took a deep breath. "I feel like a weight has been lifted," he admitted. "Before, I carried fear, pride, and if I'm honest, ignorance. Today, those feelings have been replaced with clarity and responsibility. I finally see that every action we take affects more than just ourselves. Grant looked at him and nodded. It's strange, he said. I thought being an officer meant enforcing rules and keeping people in line, but now I understand it also means listening, observing, and respecting. It's about being part of something bigger than ourselves. Helen smiled and placed a reassuring hand on Grant's shoulder. Exactly. Law enforcement isn't just about authority, it's about service. And service requires understanding, patience, and fairness. You've both seen what happens when those things are missing, and today, you've taken the first steps toward making sure it never happens again. As they walked toward the exit of the terminal, they passed passengers who had watched the earlier events unfold. Some offered nods of approval, others smiled quietly, and a few whispered to one another, clearly impressed by the humility the officers had shown. Rick and Grant realized that their actions, once seen as a mistake, had turned into a lesson for everyone watching. The incident was no longer just about them, it had become an example of accountability and courage. Over the next few days, the airport issued a statement acknowledging the events that had taken place. The statement emphasized the importance of fairness, respect, and ethical conduct in all interactions. Rick and Grant were required to attend special training sessions on bias, accountability, and professional ethics. But instead of feeling punished, they approached the training with determination and a genuine desire to improve. During the sessions, instructors used the airport incident as a case study. They highlighted how even experienced officers could make mistakes when personal biases interfere with judgment. Rick and Grant listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions, and reflecting on what they had learned. They shared their own experiences openly, admitting their mistakes and explaining how the director's response had made a lasting impression on them. Outside the classroom, the officers also began practicing the principles they had learned. They made a conscious effort to approach every situation with fairness and respect, to communicate clearly, and to observe carefully before taking action. They started mentoring newer officers, sharing their story as an example of accountability and growth. Their honesty and openness earned the respect of colleagues, and slowly, their reputations shifted from those of careless officers to ones who had learned the importance of integrity. Meanwhile, the director's presence in the media and among colleagues became a symbol of calm authority and ethical leadership. Interviews, reports, and discussions praised the way he handled the situation, emphasizing that he had turned a potentially hostile encounter into a meaningful lesson. People admired his patience, his composure, and his ability to inspire change without anger or retaliation. For Rick and Grant, the impact of that day extended beyond their professional lives. Both officers found themselves reflecting on personal relationships, community interactions, and how their attitudes could affect those around them. Rick began volunteering at local community centers, speaking to young people about respect, integrity, and responsibility. Grant focused on building stronger connections with his neighbors and colleagues, ensuring that he listened first and acted fairly in all situations. Even outside work, they noticed the subtle ways in which their behavior had changed. Simple interactions, helping someone with directions, addressing conflicts calmly, or even listening without judgment, felt more meaningful. They realized that ethical conduct was not limited to uniforms or offices, it was a principle to carry in every aspect of life. Months later, the airport still remembered the incident. Passengers occasionally mentioned it to staff, recalling how the officers had knelt in humility and apologized sincerely. It had become more than just a news story, it was now a tale about respect, accountability, and human growth. Rick and Grant, when recognized, no longer felt embarrassment but a quiet pride in how they had transformed a mistake into a lesson for themselves and others. Helen watched their progress closely. She knew that change required time, reflection, and consistent action. Seeing Rick and Grant take ownership, improve their behavior, and influence others positively reassured her that her guidance had helped, but the real work had been done by the officers themselves. They had internalized the lessons, and that was what mattered most. One day, during a routine check at the airport, Rick and Grant noticed a young traveler looking anxious. The officer approached calmly, offering assistance. The traveler explained that he had lost his passport. Instead of reacting with frustration or impatience, Rick guided him through the proper steps, listened to his concerns, and ensured he felt understood and supported. Grant followed up with additional instructions, making sure the young traveler felt secure and respected. As the traveler thanked them, Rick and Grant exchanged a glance. They realized that the lessons they had learned from the director were now a part of who they were. Their actions no longer required force or arrogance; empathy, fairness, and respect had become their tools for leadership and service. In private, the two officers reflected on how far they had come. "I never imagined I could change like this," Rick said quietly. "But now, I see that learning and growth are part of life, no matter how experienced we think we are." Grant nodded. "I agree. And it's not just about avoiding mistakes, it's about actively doing the right thing. Today, we helped someone feel safe and understood. That's more powerful than any badge or authority." The director's influence lingered not as fear, but as inspiration. He had taught them that true leadership required calm authority, ethical action, and the courage to confront mistakes honestly. That day at the airport had been a turning point, but the lessons continued to ripple outward, touching lives and shaping actions long after the immediate incident had ended. By the end of the year, Rick and Grant had become respected mentors within their department. Their story was shared in training sessions, community outreach programs, and professional discussions as an example of accountability, humility, and transformation. They understood that mistakes were inevitable, but growth was a choice, and one that required courage, reflection, and consistent action. As they walked through the airport one afternoon, past the same gate where the events had begun months ago, Rick turned to Grant. "Can you believe how different things are now?" he asked. Grant smiled. "It's amazing. We started that day as officers who had made serious mistakes, and now we're people who have learned to lead with respect and fairness. All because someone chose to teach us, not punish us." Rick nodded. "It's a lesson I will carry forever. Not just for my job, but for life." And with that, they continued their duties with renewed purpose, carrying forward the lessons of accountability, humility, and ethical action. The airport buzzed with activity around them, but in their hearts, the day the director had been wrongfully detained had transformed into a story of growth, respect, and the lasting power of doing what is right. The events of that day would never be forgotten, not by the officers, the staff, the passengers, or the director himself. It was a story of justice restored, of lessons learned, and of humanity at its best. And as Rick and Grant went about their work, they understood that the true impact of that day was not in punishment or embarrassment, but in the opportunity to grow, serve, and inspire others to do the same. Rick and Grant, the two officers who had detained the director earlier, were visibly uneasy. The memory of their actions weighed heavily on them, and they understood that this was the moment they would have to fully acknowledge their mistakes, not just privately, but publicly. They had followed him this far, and now the director's calm presence demanded a response that matched the gravity of what had happened. Helen, the supervisor, approached the officers and quietly guided them toward the open space near the gate. "This is your chance to take responsibility properly," she said softly. "Don't waste it. Speak honestly, and do it respectfully." The officers nodded, their hands slightly shaking. For the first time that day, they felt the true weight of accountability. They had acted out of bias and misunderstanding, and now they were about to confront the consequences in front of those who had witnessed parts of the incident. Rick stepped forward first, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Sir. Director," he began, his voice trembling slightly, we were wrong. What we did earlier was disrespectful and unjust. I acted out of fear and poor judgment. I allowed bias to guide me instead of law and procedure. I am deeply sorry for detaining you without cause and for humiliating you in front of others. Grant followed, his tone low but sincere. I also failed, Director. I didn't stop Rick, and I didn't speak up when I should have. I let personal bias and ignorance affect my judgment. I am truly sorry for my actions and for any distress we caused you. The director listened calmly, his expression neutral but attentive. His eyes were steady, observing the sincerity in their voices and the tension in their posture. He had seen many apologies in his career, but this one carried weight because it came from officers who were confronting the full truth of their behavior. Your words are acknowledged, the director said finally, his tone calm but firm. Apologies are meaningful only when they are accompanied by genuine understanding and a commitment to change. Do you truly understand why your actions were wrong? Rick and Grant exchanged glances. The weight of the director's gaze made it impossible to hide their thoughts. Both nodded simultaneously. Yes, sir, Rick said, his voice more confident now. We understand that authority is responsibility, not power. We understand that prejudice and bias are unacceptable, and that proper procedure must always be followed. Grant added, we also understand that our actions affected not only you, but the integrity of the law enforcement system itself. We are ready to make amends. The director's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained serious. Good. Understanding is the first step. Acknowledgement is the second. And action is the third. Today, you have the opportunity to show the world that you have learned this lesson. Actions speak louder than words. Are you prepared to act? Rick and Grant hesitated for a moment, then nodded firmly. Yes, sir. We are prepared, Rick said. Then show it, the director replied, his voice calm but authoritative. He took a step back, giving them space. Demonstrate humility and respect openly, so that those who witness this event can see that justice and learning prevail over arrogance and prejudice. For a long moment, the two officers stood silently. Then, in a gesture of full acknowledgement and humility, Rick knelt down carefully, placing one knee on the polished floor of the terminal. His head was bowed, and his hands rested lightly on his thigh. Director, he said softly, yet audibly for all nearby to hear, I kneel before you not out of fear, but out of respect and recognition of my wrongdoing. I vow to learn from this and to ensure no one else suffers from actions like mine. Grant followed, kneeling beside Rick. His posture mirrored Rick's, and he too lowered his head in acknowledgement. I kneel as well, Grant said, his voice steady. I recognize my failures, and I commit to change. I will uphold fairness, integrity, and respect in all future actions. I am truly sorry. The passengers and airport staff around them watched in silence, the weight of the moment settling on everyone present. Phones were held up discreetly, capturing the scene not as a scandal, but as a profound lesson in accountability and respect. People whispered to one another, realizing that what they were witnessing was unusual and extraordinary display of humility and ethical reflection. Helen glanced at the director, who remained standing, calm and composed. Sir, they are taking full responsibility, she said quietly. It is rare to see such openness and sincerity. The director nodded slightly, his eyes still on the officers. What you are doing is a start, he said. But remember, it must be followed by consistent action. Today is visible, but tomorrow is when your true character will be tested. Always act ethically, always treat others with fairness, and always question bias your own and that of others. The officers remained kneeling for a few more moments, understanding that this was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a real commitment to change, to professionalism, and to ethical conduct. Finally, the director gave a small nod, signaling that the acknowledgement was sufficient. Rick and Grant rose slowly, their faces solemn but clearer now, as if a weight had been lifted. They stood beside the director, no longer defensive, no longer arrogant. Their posture had changed, reflecting a newfound respect for authority, for ethics, and for the responsibilities entrusted to them as officers. The director addressed them one final time. Remember this moment. Let it guide you in every decision you make. Authority is earned through respect, fairness, and integrity, not by uniforms, ranks, or intimidation. Let today be a lesson you carry for the rest of your careers. Rick and Grant nodded, their expressions serious and reflective. We will remember, sir, Rick said. Always, sir, Grant added. The director turned toward the boarding gate, signaling that it was time for him to continue his journey. As he walked, he maintained his calm, commanding presence. Those who had gathered to witness the event felt a sense of resolution, as if justice had not only been acknowledged but had been actively restored. The officers remained a few steps behind him, absorbing the gravity of the lesson they had learned. They had come face to face with the consequences of their actions and had been given the opportunity to correct them publicly. It was a moment of transformation, an event they would not forget. Passengers and airport staff quietly resumed their activities, but the memory of what had occurred lingered. The scene had been unusual, striking, and profoundly educational. It demonstrated that even in moments of conflict and error, humility, acknowledgement, and ethical action could restore balance and respect. As the director prepared to board his flight, he looked back once. Rick and Grant stood straight now, a new resolve in their posture. They were no longer the same officers who had acted out of bias and fear earlier in the day. They had been confronted with authority, justice, and morality, and they had accepted the lesson fully. The director nodded slightly to them, a gesture of acknowledgement and encouragement. Carry this lesson forward. Let it guide you in all your future decisions, he said calmly. The officers watched him enter the plane, a sense of awe and humility washing over them. The airport resumed its normal rhythm, but for those involved, the events of the day had left a permanent mark. It was a day when arrogance was replaced with humility, bias with understanding, and fear with respect. Rick and Grant turned to Helen, who nodded approvingly. You've handled this well, she said quietly. Now, make sure it shapes your future actions, not just today's behavior. The officers nodded, silently vowing to carry this lesson forward. They had been humbled, educated, and transformed by a single encounter with a person who embodied authority, knowledge, and integrity. And as the plane doors closed and the engines roared to life, the director's calm presence lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the moment. It was a reminder that true power comes from wisdom, fairness, and ethical conduct, not from force, bias, or arrogance. For Rick and Grant, the day had begun as a routine assignment but ended as a profound lesson in humility, accountability, and respect. They had knelt not out of fear, but out of understanding and acknowledgement. And they would carry that lesson for the rest of their careers. Rick took a deep breath and stopped a few steps behind the director. His hands were clenched into fists, but his shoulders were hunched, showing the weight of shame he carried. Grant was silent, standing beside him, unable to find words. For a moment, the director wondered what their next move would be. He had already asserted authority and corrected the situation, but he sensed that something more was about to happen, something beyond protocol, something personal. Rick finally spoke, his voice shaking slightly. Sir, we owe you an apology. I don't know how to explain it, but we treated you wrong. You didn't deserve any of that. The director turned slowly, his eyes calm but firm. He studied Rick's face, noting the sincerity in his expression. I hear you, officer. But an apology is only meaningful if it is accompanied by understanding and action. Do you understand why your actions were wrong? Rick nodded quickly. Yes, sir. We let our assumptions take over. We judged you based on, I don't know, appearances, and we didn't follow proper procedure. We humiliated you, and we're sorry. The director nodded slightly, his voice even but carrying weight. Acknowledgement is important. Humility is necessary. But you must also ensure that this lesson is not forgotten. Your actions have consequences, not only for those you encounter but also for your careers and the reputation of your department. Do you understand that? Rick swallowed hard. Yes, sir. I understand completely. Grant, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with sincerity. Director. I didn't speak up when I should have. I didn't stop Rick, and I didn't think clearly. I'm sorry too. We both failed. I want to make this right. The director looked at Grant carefully. His gaze was calm but commanding. You are both in a position of authority. Your failure to act ethically is serious. You are responsible not only for your own actions but also for preventing wrongdoing by others. Admitting mistakes is the first step. Taking responsibility is the second. Following through with proper action is the third. Are you ready to commit to all three? Both officers nodded, the weight of their realization pressing heavily on them. Yes, sir. We are ready, Rick said, his voice firmer now, showing the shift in his understanding. The director's expression softened slightly. He had seen moments like this many times in his career when people confronted their own mistakes and chose to learn from them. Good. Then let this be a turning point. Treat everyone with respect, follow proper procedures, and never let prejudice cloud your judgment. That is your responsibility as officers. Do you understand? Yes, sir. We do, they said in unison, their voices steady now, carrying the humility that had been missing before. The director nodded, satisfied with their response. Then let us proceed to correct this situation completely. He motioned toward the gate, and the officers followed. As they walked, he spoke calmly, almost as if teaching a lesson. You see, authority is not about intimidation. It is not about rank or uniform. Authority is about knowledge, responsibility, and fairness. When you misuse it, even unintentionally, it can harm people, erode trust, and damage your own integrity. Today, you have learned a valuable lesson. Remember it well. Rick and Grant absorbed the words silently. They understood that this was more than a reprimand, it was an opportunity to grow, to become better officers and better individuals. Their previous arrogance had been stripped away, replaced with respect and understanding. As they reached the gate, the director noticed that several passengers had been observing the interaction. Some were filming discreetly, while others whispered among themselves. The situation had drawn attention, not just because of the officer's behavior, but because of the director's calm, commanding presence. He turned briefly to acknowledge the onlookers, giving a small nod. His demeanor radiated authority without aggression, respect without fear, and confidence without arrogance. Once they were at the gate, Helen, the supervisor, approached them again. Director, I want to personally apologize on behalf of the airport and my team. We will ensure that your experience is documented correctly and that the officers involved undergo appropriate training. You have our assurance that nothing like this will happen again. The director nodded, his expression calm. Thank you. Accountability is essential. Training is essential. I expect both to be carried out fully. And I expect that these officers, now aware of their mistakes, will act responsibly in the future. Rick stepped forward, his voice firm and sincere. Sir, we are committed. We will learn from this and ensure it does not happen again. I promise. Grant added, me too, Director. I will take full responsibility for my actions and ensure this lesson stays with me. The director observed them carefully. Very well. Remember that humility, knowledge, and ethical action are what define a true officer, not mere authority or rank. Never forget this lesson. For a moment, the atmosphere was heavy with realization and reflection. The officers' heads were bowed slightly, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. The director's presence had transformed the situation completely. What began as a humiliating detention based on bias had become an opportunity for education and accountability. Helen glanced at the officers and then at the director. "Sir, if you will allow, we will ensure you board safely and that this matter is addressed fully before your flight departs." The director nodded. "Thank you. That will be sufficient." As they moved toward the boarding area, the officers followed behind the director, maintaining a respectful distance. They were silent, absorbed in thought. Each step was a reminder of the lesson they had learned: power without responsibility is meaningless, and prejudice is a dangerous guide. Once at the gate, the director prepared to board his flight. He turned briefly to the officers one last time. "Go forth with this knowledge. Treat everyone with fairness and dignity. Let your actions from this day forward reflect the lesson you have learned. That is all I ask." Rick and Grant nodded, their expressions serious and respectful. "Yes, sir. We will," they said simultaneously. The director moved forward to the plane, calm and composed. Behind him, the officers remained still for a moment, fully aware of the gravity of what had transpired. They had begun the day with misplaced confidence, acting on bias and assumption. Now, they were humbled, transformed by a direct encounter with authority, knowledge, and moral courage. Passengers at the gate watched as the director boarded, sensing that something extraordinary had just occurred. The officers stayed behind for a few moments, reflecting on their actions, the consequences, and the lessons they had received. This was more than a personal apology, it was a lesson in ethics, responsibility, and the true meaning of authority. As the plane doors closed and the engines began to roar, the officers finally exhaled collectively, their tension slowly leaving their bodies. They had faced the consequences of their actions and had been given an opportunity to correct them. They had been reminded that authority carries responsibility and that true power comes not from fear or intimidation, but from knowledge, ethics, and respect. For the director, the day continued as it always did, with calm confidence, unwavering focus, and a sense of duty. He had faced prejudice, injustice, and misunderstanding, and yet he had emerged with his dignity intact and had transformed the situation into a lesson for others. His calm presence had turned fear and arrogance into humility and understanding, leaving a lasting impact on those who had wronged him. And for Rick and Grant, the lesson would stay with them forever. They had witnessed firsthand that bias and prejudice have no place in authority, and that true respect is earned through knowledge, fairness, and ethical action. Their journey toward becoming better officers had begun, inspired by the calm, unshakable presence of a man who knew the value of patience, composure, and justice. The director remained calm, noting every word and gesture. He knew that in law enforcement, demeanor could change the course of events. Remaining composed was essential. He handed the officer his credentials again, showing the official FBI seal. "You may verify it with your supervisor," he said evenly. "I have flights to catch. Please expedite the process." Once the director was seated in the supervisor's small office, the atmosphere became tense yet controlled. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the airport ventilation system and the occasional distant call from the terminal. The two officers who had initially detained him stood awkwardly near the door, shuffling their feet and avoiding eye contact. Their previous confidence had vanished, replaced by a mixture of fear and embarrassment. They had never confronted anyone with this level of authority, let alone the head of a federal agency. The director, however, remained calm. His posture was relaxed but firm, his eyes alert, observing every gesture, every subtle shift in body language. The supervisor, a woman named Helen, motioned for the officers to step back slightly. She looked directly at the director, her tone respectful yet firm. "Sir, I understand the situation has escalated unnecessarily. I assure you, We are taking this very seriously. Can you explain how this all began so we can correct it immediately? The director nodded. His voice was calm, each word deliberate and clear. This began at the checkpoint when my identification was challenged without cause. I requested clarification and compliance with proper procedure, which was ignored. Instead, I was asked to accompany officers to a holding area without any explanation beyond vague allegations of a security concern. This is a violation of protocol, and it raises serious questions about bias and judgment. Helen nodded, taking notes on a small pad. She glanced at the officers, who now shifted uncomfortably under the director's steady gaze. The realization was settling in, their actions were not just inappropriate, they were career-threatening. The director continued, his tone measured but firm. I am willing to cooperate fully with a legitimate inquiry, but it must follow the law and proper procedure. Anything less is unacceptable. One of the officers, a younger man named Rick, cleared his throat nervously. Sir. I didn't know. I mean, I was just doing my job. We were following instructions. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear he was trying to hide. The director didn't respond immediately. He looked at Rick, then at the other officer, a man named Grant. His eyes were calm but piercing, a look honed over decades of experience in law enforcement. Following instructions does not justify illegal or biased actions, he said finally. It is your responsibility to question orders or actions that violate the law. Ignorance is not an excuse when a person's rights and dignity are at stake. Grant shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. He opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, unsure what to say. He had never been spoken to in this way by anyone, let alone someone whose authority exceeded his own by many levels. The director's calm but firm demeanor was beginning to strip away the officers' confidence. They were no longer in control of the situation, they were now subjects under scrutiny. Helen spoke up, her voice steady but apologetic. Sir, I admit this was mishandled. The officers involved acted without full understanding of the circumstances. I will ensure the situation is corrected immediately. The director nodded slowly. Acknowledgement is a start, but accountability is essential. This is not just about me, it is about ensuring that prejudice and bias do not interfere with law enforcement operations. I expect this incident to be documented fully and addressed appropriately. Rick shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Sir. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I didn't know what else to do. The director's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. Fear and confusion are understandable in stressful situations. But when those fears lead to unjust treatment of others, it becomes a serious problem. You must learn from this, and you must ensure it never happens again. Understanding the law and acting ethically is part of your responsibility. The room grew quiet for a moment. Rick and Grant exchanged glances, realizing the truth in the director's words. Their confidence had crumbled completely. They had been acting from prejudice and bias, and now they understood the magnitude of their mistake. The director continued, his voice calm, almost instructional. Officers, you were placed in a position of authority, and authority carries responsibility. When you use it without proper understanding, or when personal bias interferes with judgment, the consequences can be severe not just for those you detain, but for your own careers and reputations. Today, you have seen firsthand how quickly the situation can turn against those who act unjustly. Rick's hands trembled slightly as he clenched them. Sir. I understand. I really do. Grant nodded slowly, looking down at the floor. I never realized. I mean, I didn't think it was serious until now. The director leaned back slightly in his chair, maintaining eye contact. His tone softened just enough to convey authority without anger. Realizing your mistake is the first step. Taking responsibility is the second. And ensuring it never happens again is the third. I expect all three to be followed. Helen, the supervisor, spoke up again. Sir, would you like me to escort you back to your gate? I can ensure you are treated properly for the rest of your travel. The director nodded. Yes, please. But I also expect that a full report of this incident will be submitted to the appropriate federal authorities. And I want the officers involved to undergo training on bias, ethics, and proper protocol. This cannot happen again, not to me, not to anyone else. The officers nodded, silently acknowledging the gravity of their situation. They had realized that this encounter had been a turning point. What had begun as a situation where they believed they held all the power had quickly reversed. The director, through calm authority and deep knowledge of the law, had shifted the balance entirely. As they walked back toward the main terminal, the director remained calm and composed. His presence alone commanded respect. Travelers and staff who noticed the small group couldn't help but feel the tension. Phones were being raised again, some capturing video. Whispers spread through the crowd as people speculated about what had just happened. The officers, once arrogant and confident, now walked with their heads down. The lesson had been harsh but necessary. They had been reminded that authority is not power, it is responsibility. Misusing it, especially with prejudice, can lead to humiliation, legal consequences, and professional downfall. Back at the gate, the director finally turned to face the officers directly. His tone was calm but firm. I hope you have learned something today. Treat every person with dignity, follow the law, and do not let personal bias dictate your actions. That is your duty as law enforcement officers. Rick swallowed hard. Yes, sir, we understand. Grant nodded silently, still processing the weight of the lesson. The director gave a small, approving nod and turned toward the boarding area. The officers watched him go, fully aware that their behavior had been exposed, and that their actions would not be forgotten. For them, the encounter was a humbling experience, one that would change how they approached their duties in the future. The story of this airport incident would spread quickly, and not just through social media. Within the law enforcement community, word of a high-ranking official calmly handling and correcting a situation caused by prejudice would serve as a reminder of what true authority looks like. The director had demonstrated that knowledge, composure, and moral courage could turn even the most dangerous or embarrassing situations into opportunities for learning and reform. By the end of the encounter, the officers understood something essential: their bias had been confronted, their mistakes had been exposed, and the power they once thought they had was only an illusion. True power came from knowledge, responsibility, and ethical action. The director had shown all of that, quietly but decisively, without ever raising his voice or losing control. As the director moved through the terminal, the officers and the supervisor followed behind, ensuring his safety and proper treatment. He kept his calm demeanor, fully aware that his actions had already made a lasting impression. For everyone involved, the day had begun as routine, but it ended as a profound lesson in respect, authority, and accountability. The director boarded his flight, still calm and collected, while the officers watched, humbled and reflective. The situation had reversed completely. They had begun with authority based on rank and uniform, but they ended with understanding, respect, and the knowledge that actions have consequences. This experience would stay with them forever. The officer's frown deepened, and he motioned for another officer nearby to come over. "Check this out," he said quietly, but not quietly enough for the director to miss. The second officer looked at the ID, then back at the first officer, nodding subtly. "Sir, we are going to have to ask you to come with us," the first officer said, this time his voice colder. The director blinked once, slightly taken aback. "Come with you? For what reason?" His tone remained calm but firm. The officer hesitated, avoiding eye contact. There's a security concern." Please cooperate. The director raised an eyebrow. He had faced dangerous criminals, hostile environments, and high-pressure operations. He had never been treated with this level of suspicion without cause. Yet, he remained composed. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am not aware of any reason why I should be detained. Please explain the concern, or I will have to contact my office immediately. At this, the officer hesitated further, looking nervously at his colleague. It was clear they were not expecting this reaction. Most people in their position might have panicked or complied silently, but not him. The director's calm authority made the officers uncomfortable. You need to come with us for questioning," the first officer stammered, struggling to maintain control. He could sense the attention of other travelers around them. Phones were already being raised, some passengers whispered to each other, curious and concerned. The director remained silent for a moment, observing the scene. He noticed the tension in the officers' posture, the hesitation in their voices. This was no longer just a procedural matter, it had become a test of authority and judgment. He decided to handle it as he had handled many situations before, with calm firmness and a clear demonstration of his knowledge of the law. "Officers," he said, his voice firm now, resonating with the weight of experience and rank. "I request that you explain to me the legal basis for this detention. I am happy to cooperate fully if there is a legitimate concern, but any actions taken without proper authority will be documented and addressed through the appropriate channels." The officers exchanged nervous glances. They were used to people complying without question, but here was a man who had faced some of the country's most dangerous criminals, and he was standing calmly before them, unafraid and aware of their missteps. The balance of power in the small checkpoint room was shifting. "Sir, please, just come with us. There is nothing to worry about," the officer said, his voice rising slightly, betraying his uncertainty. The director shook his head slowly. "I will not move without an explanation. I am fully capable of verifying my identity and authority, and I request that you follow proper protocol. Failure to do so will be reported immediately to federal authorities." Other travelers had begun to take notice. Phones were recording the encounter, whispers filled the air, and a few security cameras were already capturing the scene. The director remained composed, every movement deliberate, every word measured. He understood the importance of calm presence in turning a dangerous and humiliating situation into a controlled interaction. The first officer's jaw tightened. He was frustrated, realizing he had no legitimate reason for this arrest beyond his personal bias. He glanced at his colleagues, who avoided his gaze. The director, noticing this, made eye contact with each of them in turn. His calm and unwavering stare seemed to strip away their confidence, exposing the uncertainty and fear beneath. Finally, the officer said, "Sir, we need to verify something. Please cooperate." His words were less commanding now, tinged with hesitation. The director nodded slightly, signaling that he would cooperate, but on his terms. "I will cooperate fully, provided it is lawful and professional. I will also be documenting every interaction for accountability. Please proceed correctly." At that moment, the airport security supervisor arrived, a middle-aged woman with a professional demeanor. She had been observing the growing crowd and the tense situation and immediately sensed that the officers were in over their heads. She addressed the director politely. "Sir, I understand there has been a misunderstanding. Let's step into my office so we can clarify everything." The director agreed, his calm authority intact. He knew that remaining professional, even in the face of blatant bias, was crucial. As he walked alongside the supervisor, the officers hesitated, unsure whether to follow or to challenge him. The supervisor motioned firmly, and they reluctantly complied, still uneasy. As they moved away from the main terminal area, passengers whispered to each other. Some expressed admiration for the director's composure, others' frustration at the officer's behavior. The scene had already begun to spread through social media, though the director remained unaware of it. He focused instead on the immediate situation, preparing for the next steps with the same careful thought he applied to national security operations. Once in the supervisor's office, the director continued to maintain his calm. He explained his position, his credentials, and his legal authority, all while noting the procedural errors that had led to his detention. The officers remained silent, aware that their actions were being scrutinized by someone far more experienced and powerful than themselves. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by the realization that they had seriously misjudged the situation. The supervisor listened carefully, acknowledging the mistake without delay. "I apologize, Director. This was a misunderstanding. We will ensure that proper procedures are followed immediately." Even though the situation had not yet fully resolved, the director's calm, professional approach had begun to shift the power dynamic. What started as an unjust arrest based on prejudice was now turning into a moment of accountability. The officers, once acting with authority and bias, were now on the defensive, realizing that their actions were wrong. As Part 1 ends, the airport's bustling energy contrasts with the quiet tension in the supervisor's office. The director sits calmly, a model of professionalism and authority, while the officers begin to understand the consequences of their prejudice. This moment sets the stage for the unfolding events, where calm knowledge and moral strength will confront bias and arrogance head-on.